Hello, in this video I want to continue the mini-series that we've been doing with Alexis Gumbs in space. This is something that I thought was super relevant to do, at least to capture like what I think debating against these affirmatives will be like, and like what these affirmatives will really need to focus on in order to be effective affirmatives, all of which I think are really important questions when you're trying to figure out what the kind of scope of the space resolution is. I think for LDers, this is going to be a really interesting resolution because I feel like when anytime space comes up in a debate topic, there's so much ground for people to kind of work off of in terms of like the types of arguments they want to read and what stuff they think is good, and like how far they can kind of reach with imagination and play with different concepts that blend like studies of time and space and science and technology and stuff. And I feel like Alexis P. Gumbs has a lot to say for this particular resolution that will kind of like resonate with a lot of arguments that teams are making, or a lot of things that they're kind of like taking from various works and archive and spill in our dissertation and other places. And I think that there are a lot of like kind of like ways in which you can pull from the question of what this kind of like looks like in terms of like how you're debating it stylistically and the way that it may apply to other affirmatives that aren't like strictly Afrofuturism, but also kind of engage in a lot of the kind of like storytelling aesthetic performances that are engaged in similar kinds of politics. And I think that there are a lot of really interesting ways for you to kind of like use that in order to figure out how you kind of prepare for other arguments in the future. I think that for this particular set of two videos, I want you to be able to kind of like understand better ways to answer these affirmatives. And so I want to talk about like case arguments, framework and T arguments, criticisms, counterparts, and disads, all of which I think that are kind of like viable against these types of affirmatives and the way they kind of show up strategically, as well as kind of just talking over some of the general priorities that you should have when you're prepping against this, so that you can kind of have a toolbox to like respond to these arguments without like resorting to really generics that don't really on point respond to like a lot of the stuff that Gumbs in particular is arguing in this lane. I think that when you're just trying to figure out the priorities of how you should kind of be answering these arguments, a lot of the stuff that you kind of want to like situate your offense at the top with is critiques of survival and critiques of like how we kind of like relate ourselves to the question of survival. I feel like one of the things that Gumbs is kind of like work thrives off of is the argument about like the ability for like blackness and specifically black feminist theory to be something that like kind of infinitely survives through time. Her kind of like usage of things like the roach in her dissertation, and her kind of like usage of arguments about like how black people are kind of like, and black feminists are surviving on the margins, and like the apocalyptic futurism that she's talking about in M Archive, all of which kind of like relate to like the possibility of like the current kind of like world and society that we're able to is able to be kind of like overcome with regardless of the kind of conditions of like violence that are produced, and to use that as a way to critique how life and kind of like death are thought of in the context of like capitalism, anti-blackness, gender, sexual violence, and other kind of like sources, etc. And I think that when you're trying to figure out how you kind of want to do this, I think that starting with a base critique about why that kind of like platform for what politics should look like is wrong is the first place where you kind of want to situate a lot of your offense. I feel like in the context of just like what case arguments make the most sense, I think that having like a specific critique of just like why survival-based politics, whether it's because they're reactionary, whether it's because they're too localized and don't allow for big movements, whether they're, or if it's because like they kind of like romanticize the ability to overcome like the present of like anti-black violence as if it isn't like something that's constantly producing its own death and that people aren't able to survive from as like its own process of forgetting. I think there are a bunch of ways in which you can kind of critique that kind of like arc of thought in terms of like how survival is able to operate itself as like a essential like framing for like how Gumbs is able to come towards like their kind of like epistemological framing of how they introduce and relate themselves to the archive and various other material praxis. And I think that starting with that criticism can allow a really generative kind of like place for you to maybe get to the source of what the methodology does, regardless of like how the affirmative is kind of taking its interaction with Gumbs's work. And I think that having that kind of like specific interaction there is like really important for you to kind of set the basis for what your other criticisms can be in terms of like how you take up like why this particular framing of how we should do politics is maybe wrong. I think that in the context of like other case arguments or other types of things that you want to be focusing on, making really good arguments about like what the threshold for solvency should be and the way in which they should relate to the question of space. I think that you making good arguments on this about like why the kind of like the metaphors of like space can be particularly damaging, not only in the context of their ability to frame like what the resolution is, but also to be able to frame like how we're able to think about what the limitations of what of that resolution are, and like the kind of like romanticization of space as like its own kind of like new space for colonization, etc., can all be kind of reiterated in the way that space is kind of like romanticizes this like infinite place of excess. And I think that adding those into like various types of critiques that you're making on case can be really important, regardless of whether or not you want to make a strategy that involves like really policy-based strategy or critical-based strategy, because I think that having like a really specific response that turns the kind of like necessary mechanisms for their affirmative method to operate can be really essential to making your life just a lot easier easier on the affirmative as a whole, and I think can make it a lot easier for you to like kind of like make the other arguments that you want in the other flows to really like operate a lot smoothly, because you kind of have these indices that are making sense and framing a lot of the concerns you have about like the overall condition of like that the affirmative kind of produces both inside and outside of debate. I think that then when you kind of go to like a framework and T basis, a lot of the things that I think are kind of your concerns for the framework and T debate are really about the ways in which you can kind of like make arguments about like why the kind of like playing with the fantasy and kind of like reality portion of like how the resolution operates in relationship to space opens up a lot of room for teams to be able to like continually use space as a metaphor, which opens up like various ways of thinking about criticism and affirmatives that are way outside of the bound of the resolution and would be like really hard and unpredictable to prepare for. And so I think that making a lot of arguments that are just based on like strong modeling arguments for like what this kind of like affirmative does to the resolution is really important, because I feel like the harder that you can push them into like an impact turn debate and allow yourself to kind of like go into the procedural kind of like formalities for why these particular types of like ways of relating and thinking about the resolution are like inefficient, I think the better you get in terms of being able to like force them to kind of like debate on your terms. I think a lot of the times the like best kind of framework and T arguments against this type of affirmative are ones that are kind of like not based on the question of just like what skills are able to be made, because I feel like the affirmative will have so many arguments about like it's a question of like whose skills and like the way in which they're able to access particular ones, but arguments that are about like why the kind of like a way in which they kind of like turn space into a metaphor and use it as something that can be exercised as a means to like talk about various political issues or like various ways of understanding, like for instance the world around us that isn't contextualized by a definition of space that lends itself to outer space, could make it a lot harder for this particular resolution to be nuanced in a way that allows for the real like detailed readings of like what the space is and like the kind of like necessary legal kind of like demands that we need to take up in order to refuse the operations of like space privatization and their ability to kind of like happen in the first place, all of which I think are really interesting angles to take up against this affirmative, and I think allow you to kind of like open up space for you to not have to win like any particular TVA, but rather win that there's a larger danger to like the ability of this affirmative to kind of like mess up the procedural kind of like basis for what makes the resolution like fair, debatable, and predictable, and on the other end versus like trying to actually win it, you're going to get en route to things like their skill arguments and stuff like that, because I feel like that's the place where they're kind of like most prepared to kind of like hash out a debate on like why they access those questions better. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll be able to tune into more videos that I'll be doing talking about Alexis Gumbs, space, and other stuff as well. And yeah, thank you as always for watching.